G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. And perhaps the most dangerous idea in politics is that we are on the brink of a fascist future, that we're sleepwalking towards calamity, much like people did in the 1930s, and that we're just not taking people like Boris Johnson and Donald Trump and Marine Le Pen seriously enough. Dennis Glover is taking them seriously enough. Some would say he's taking them all too seriously and is drawing bows that are all too long. That's what today's conversation is about. Dennis is a senior speechwriter. He's written for some of the most senior left-wing politicians in Australia in recent history. He's also a novelist, and his new book is not a novel. It's called Repeat, A Warning from History, and it looks at the history of the 20th century, in particular Hitler, and draws analogies with politics today. It's an interesting conversation. It's interesting to hear Dennis begin by articulating this worldview, which I would characterize as being probably the mainstream left-wing attitude towards what's going on the right. And then in the final third or so of this conversation, I, as you would expect me to do, push back a little bit, and the responses are fascinating. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. The one, the only, Dennis Glover.
Well, we all aspire, in the magazines they have this thing, what did you have today? And then they have someone analyse it, and they always say, I had a mint tea for breakfast, and then I had, a handful of mung beans. And basically they're going to die of starvation.
Have you seen the I think is it Hunter Thompson or one of those gonzo guys from the 70s he wrote down a list of everything that he ate in a day, and I don't know if he was taking the piss or not, but it was like wake up at 11, line of cocaine, half a bottle of whiskey, and then it goes. There's basically no nutrition whatsoever. It's almost exclusively whiskey, beer, and cocaine.
I know a couple of people like this. They're not far from death.
That's right. Fascinating book. I finished it last night. Terrifying. Don't know what to make of it quite. So I'm looking forward to getting stuck into it. Yeah. I think an interesting point that you say in the introduction is that you want people to grasp, and I quote, how extraordinary and ugly current events are compared to those of just a couple of decades ago. Yeah. I think that's a good place to pick your brain. What do you mean by that?
What I mean is that the world has changed absolutely incredibly in a downward spiral, and people don't realise just what a dire situation the world's in. I mean, we've got a war going on in Ukraine now, a big series of land battles going on in Ukraine. We've got people attempting to assassinate the US president. We've got fascist-sounding populist leaders springing up all over the world. This isn't normal. The world's entered a sort of a different turn, and we have to wake up and realise it. That's pretty much my argument.
The world or Western liberal democracies, or both?
Well, the problem has started outside liberal democracies, hasn't it? It started in these countries which have taken a turn towards fascism and or at the very least, sort of a radical brand of right-wing populism, and it's challenging us now to respond. So we have to wake up.
Right, but I mean, the reason I asked the question is because I think you can look at it on one level from a geopolitical perspective, right? And I think everyone from both sides, from all sides of politics within Western liberal democracies, would regard this as a precarious moment for Western liberal democracy, as the Fukuyama model, the kind of end of history. We won the world wars, and now we're setting up shop, and everything's nice and stable, and the Cold War the end of the Cold War only seals the deal, and the collapse of the Soviet Union only proves that we're triumphant. Clearly, that's gone away. Clearly, the international and global institutions and like the hegemony of the West is being overtly challenged from Beijing and from Moscow, and that is causing ripple effects among smaller countries, and you talk quite a lot about Hungary in this book as an example of a former democracy that's become essentially authoritarian. And so that's one. I just want to keep that in one column, because then I think another portion of your argument, which is the one that I think is a trickier case to make, is that Western liberal democracies are facing a threat that might be akin to the sorts of threats that they faced in the 1930s. From populists like Donald Trump.
Yeah. And, not just Donald Trump, but we've gone through it with Boris Johnson. He was seen off. In France recently, we've had a big challenge to sort of the centre and the left from the RN, Le Pen's party, which has links to fascism and going back all the way to the Second World War. In Italy, we have Meloni's government, which is a sort of a hard right government. It's everywhere around the world. Liberal democracy is itself having to face off these threats. I mean, these small parties of the hard right were sort of a joke not long ago, just getting a few percent of the vote, and now they're challenging mainstream parties for government, and in some places winning it.
In some ways, isn't the experience of Meloni and of Le Pen a contradiction to the core thesis of your book, which is that that these parties represent an existential threat to liberal democracy of a scale that we've seen before in figures like Hitler and Mussolini, in the sense that Meloni did reach power, and Italy is not a Mussolini-style fascist state, and Le Pen is not her father in the 1970s. They are now a protest vote party that is basically, wants to massively curtail immigration, but is certainly not in favour of rounding people up into concentration camps.
Well, the interesting thing about Le Pen is she hasn't got power yet. So this is the whole point about these people, is that they sound moderate. They tell us they're going to be moderate until they get into power. It's not to say that she will get into power and become, a reincarnation of Adolf Hitler or anything like that. It's that she'll get into power and, start deporting immigrants, start, really cracking down hard on minorities, and really becoming incredibly illiberal and even to the extent of changing the electoral system to, water down democracy and so forth, which Trump has threatened to do. So it's, these people, it was just like Hitler. You think of Hitler in the 1920s and 30s, he tried to sound quite moderate when he was trying to get into power in the late 20s and early 30s. And then, and people trusted him. They thought they could control him. And the moment he got in, well, they were for the chop.
Sure. But I mean, in the more proximate and sort of historically close case of Meloni, who you mentioned in Italy, she sounded more extreme while she was campaigning because she wanted to drum up rebellious support. And then in government, she's been more moderate.
Yeah, but the fact that these people are getting into power is a source of worry. I mean, we thought that the hard right were being literally killed off at the end of the Second World War. I mean, a lot of them were executed at Nuremberg, and Mussolini was was strung up and killed. We thought that all that was behind us, and now it's all come back. And sure, they haven't turned out to be as radical as their forebears, but it's still worrisome that these sorts of people who are talking about race and so forth are getting quite a large percentage of the vote in mainstream countries. Like you think of Germany, the AfD, they've almost got the same vote now as the Social Democrats. I mean, I find that incredibly concerning.
Why do you think it's happening?
Well, I think after the end of the Second World War, we created a global economy, or at least in the West, where the fruits of the economy were distributed fairly amongst people, and democracy was seen to work for ordinary people. This was the work, in some ways, of John Maynard Keynes after Bretton Woods. They set up a world economy that worked for ordinary people. Then in the late 1970s and 80s onwards, this started to unravel. The workers who had benefited from all this redistribution of wealth and income stopped benefiting, saw themselves as losers, and inevitably they were attracted to these sorts of populists. And this is exactly the same thing that happened after the First World War. In 1918, John Maynard Keynes writes The Economic Consequences of the Peace, in which he says, the most important thing we can do now the First World War is over is make sure Germany is an economic success, get world trade going, because we can see what's happening, east of Germany in Russia, where there's a revolution and a civil war, people starving to death, eating each other, literally cannibalism. And we have to stop this sort of slide into, the end of civilization happening by setting up an economy that works for everyone to get a sound basis for democracy. And in some ways, we've after 30 or 40 years of success, we unlearned that lesson to our cost.
Unlearned that lesson in what way?
Well, think of how Putin has come to power. After the fall of the Soviet Union, there was an attempted almost capitalist revolution in Russia. Shock therapy, Gillard, the finance minister, called it, which led to the total collapse of living standards of ordinary Russians, who lost faith in liberal democracy, which had only been going for a few years, and ended up with them wanting to put their faith in a hard man who could install order and get their living standards back up. And this is what's given us Vladimir Putin, with all the troubles that he's causing in the world at the moment.
What's feeding voters distrust and disaffection that is leading them to vote for far-right parties in the West, though?
The feeling that they've been left behind by the economy. I mean, if you think of where Donald Trump's support is strong, in the old Rust Belt states around Pennsylvania and so forth, in those parts of America where the white working class feel that they've just been forgotten. They feel the Democrats and their liberal elites don't care for them anymore. So they go for someone who talks like them, who seems to care about their issues, even if he doesn't. Somebody like Donald Trump. And the similar thing happened in the north of England, where Boris Johnson, populist in a different sort of way, a more civilized English sort of way, if you can put it, had a similar effect in the voters in the north of England who used to be strong Labor supporters.
Why aren't they
strong Labor supporters anymore?
Yeah.
I think what is the Labor Party? What are Labor parties? They're parties of the trade union movement, and the trade union movement was built on organisation of workers in the industrial world, huge factories. And this formed a base of a pyramid upon which the Labor Party was built. Well, that's all gone now. Those workers don't have those jobs. They're not organised into trade unions. They don't get their view of the world from trade union leaders and trade union ideology anymore, and cut adrift from any thought patterns. They're they hear people like Trump and so forth, and they think, yeah, he sounds like us. Let's go for him. And I think this, the problem is that a lot of this is built on things that are very inimical to liberal democracy: racism, dividing people by race, making people angry, the triumph of lies over the truth, and so forth. This is how populists always work, and it's not good for people who believe in democracy.
What's interesting is that your analysis of why people would be disaffected is almost identical to the analysis by one of your arch villains in the book, Steve Bannon, who you liken to Lenin, who was, who Steve Bannon himself has expressed admiration for.
Yeah.
Bannon's point would be, it's all very well for elites to look down their noses and, wave their arms and run around with their asses on fire about the Trump phenomenon, but they created it through creating an economy that's no longer working for people. And, so Trump represents the people seizing back control from an elite that has long since given up on them. Is there any daylight between you and Bannon on that?
Well, I think the analysis is correct, but the answer is wrong. Bannon would, the answer of people like Bannon and Trump and others is to make people angry about what's happened to them and then just completely ignore them once they get into power. They're just walking onto people's backs to get into power. They don't have any positive policies that are going to help these people. They're not building a modern manufacturing economy. They're not increasing taxes for the rich so they can redistribute wealth.
Well, they're not helping the people. You're picking the policies that they're not doing. But if you ask their supporters about the policies that their supporters actually care about, their supporters don't talk about, we need to raise taxes on the rich. Their supporters talk about, we shouldn't be flooded with so many cheap Chinese goods, and we shouldn't be flooded with so many people across the border who don't have a right to be here, and we shouldn't have so many people coming into the country. So in that respect, Bannon and Trump are being responsive to the wishes of their base. You might disagree with the analysis of the base, that that's what's actually in their interests, but that's how the base would articulate their interests. There's too much immigration. There are too many people getting ahead of traditional American families. The government has its thumb on the scales of, I don't know, whatever. Pick the target du jour that the right wing is pointing at. Black single mothers who are receiving welfare benefits or whatever it is. That's the way they would articulate the problem.
Yeah, which is exactly how Hitler articulated the problem, and that's the problem that we have, which is to blame others and so forth, which isn't really going to solve their problems. I mean, I think they have a point in some ways. Lots of sort of liberal democratic politicians around the world now are waking up to the fact that immigration has become such a political issue for democracy that there have to be ways found to address it peacefully. But I don't think the way to go about it doing it is to, stir up racial animosity between people, which, recall what's happened just in the last week in the UK, where lots of misinformation has led to riots in which, hotels, in which refugees are living were attempted to be burnt to the ground. People, we can't. This is exactly what happened in Germany in the 20s and 30s, and it's the sort of thing I think any decent society wants to avoid.
But I mean, yes, and all of that is horrible, and it can also be the case that, like, where I'm coming from is I'm wary of stumbling into Godwin's law here, where anything that anyone does that Hitler also did enables us to say they're Hitler. There might be things that people are doing right now which are which we don't like because we're on the left, but which are not as existentially threatening as Hitler, and which we would be more likely to head off genocide, civil strife, the collapse of Western civilization by trying to understand than by simply saying that they're Hitler. For example, the UK riots, there are people who are persona non gratas in the UK who for years have been saying the levels of immigration are higher than people want them to be. There is too much illegal immigration.
Yeah.
40,000 people are coming across the English Channel in boats every single year. Many, many hundreds of thousands of people are coming in legally. There are towns and villages whose demography has completely changed. And anyone who points out that that might be destabilizing for local populations is called a Hitler. And now sort of there are chickens coming home to roost. And of course, there's completely inexcusable misinformation, lies, barbarism, arson, in some cases, brutality. This is not in any way to excuse that. But I do want to sort of understand it at a deeper level than just being like, well, the far right is the far right. They were dropped from the heavens upon us. And anytime there's anyone who smells a little bit like Hitler, they should be hanged. You know what I mean? Like, we got to do better than that.
Well, let's take a couple of things there. I think the first thing is that a lot of social democratic and liberal politicians around the world have recognised for a long time now the problems that come with, if you could call it uncontrolled immigration. There's a problem of simply physically trying to control your borders, and people are grappling with how to do it. And you'll find that Keir Starmer's government that's coming in now is going to try and tackle it by talking to other nations from which these people are coming from and try and tackle it at source. So I think people are aware of the enormity of this problem and the problems that it's causing for democracy. It's just that people on the centre left aren't going around demonising people and stirring up hatreds that could lead to death and disaster.
Of course, they're not doing that, but they're also spending a lot of time jumping down the throats of anybody who tries to flag it as a problem. I'm not sure that it's true that everybody has been regarding it as a problem, because there's been a consensus on both sides of politics to maintain very high levels of immigration for a long time, regardless of what signals the electorate tried to give successive governments.
I don't think it's a matter of jumping down the throats of anyone who says it's a problem. They're jumping down the throats of people who are trying to use this to cause trouble and violence, and use it as a basis for stirring up racist agitation. That's who they're jumping down the throats.
Well, it depends what jumping down the throats we're talking about. I could show you 1,000 tweets and Guardian columns which claim that when anyone says that there's too much immigration, that person is motivated by xenophobia or racism.
Well, is the Guardian totally representative, of everybody in mainstream?
No. I'm just pointing out that there's a penalty that exists in public discourse and elite discourse.
Yeah, there's that. Look, the other part of your question is the idea of raising the comparison with Hitler. We have this sort of thing, the Godwin's law thing. Nobody's allowed to talk about Hitler because everything eventually descends into talking about Hitler, and we get nowhere. I don't think that's right. The Hitler of the 1920s and 20s and early 30s, before he got into power and became the genocidal maniac, was very much a similar figure to somebody like Donald Trump and other populist figures in Europe. He was a radical right-wing populist who used the democratic system to try and get into power through the ballot box, who held huge rallies using demagogic language to call people, vermin who were poisoning the blood of our society, attacking immigrants, attacking others, Jews. Very, very similar. I mean, I think there are lots of valid comparisons between Hitler and a lot of the right-wing populists we see around the world today, right now. And this is the early Hitler. I mean, I don't think that even were Donald Trump to get into power later this year, that he would necessarily turn into somebody like Hitler. But I think the lessons of history are there, that this can happen. If something can happen once, well, it can happen again. And we're crazy if we think that we're immune to repeating history, because, it can happen. In fact, a lot of history is being repeated right now. As we sit here talking, there's a huge battle going on involving thousands of soldiers, artillery, tanks and aircraft in a place called Kursk, which was the site of arguably the largest battle of the Second World War, on the same place. And a lot of the soldiers who will be fighting in that battle would be the great-grandchildren of members of the Red Army who fought on the same place to get rid of Hitler. I mean, in some ways, history is repeating in front of our eyes right now, and I don't think we realise the degree to which it's all happening again.
I'm glad that you make that point, because one of the most sort of compelling aspects of your book, I think, is its ability to drag us back into the kind of arbitrariness and subjectivity of the moment that we find ourselves in, and how we have a bias towards thinking that this moment is unique in some way and that other moments were all stodgy. You say that grasping the past means recognizing that to those who lived through it, it looked just like it does today.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not a black and white,
No. I think one of the reasons why people think the past can't repeat, while we can't end up in another world war and so forth, is that all of those documentaries about it are in black and white, and we look at the documentaries of the First and Second World War. I mean, they're colorizing them now, making them look a little bit more like us. But we think, it's almost like it happened on another planet, in another world. But in fact, it was just like us. So, for example, if you think of when Hamas crossed the border and slaughtered those young people at that at that Nova Music Festival in Israel. Well, to them, when the Einsatzgruppen went into Poland in 1939, it was probably a beautiful sunny day as well, and it probably looked exactly the same, and they were just as terrified. The past didn't happen in black and white; it happened in vivid digital color, exactly as it happens to us. And so we're crazy to think that what happened then isn't similar to what's happened now. You think of the destruction of cities like Mariupol in Ukraine, just like the destruction of Stalingrad, the bombing of Kiev, and the bombing of Gaza. This is exactly what happened during the Second World War, the mass bombing of cities where tens of thousands of people were killed.
I mean,
it's the same sort of thing.
I would just add, it's nowhere near the scale. It's obviously feels the same to the person who's having a bomb dropped on their apartment building.
Yes, exactly.
But when you look at the firebombing of Dresden or the total impunity with which we prosecuted wars like World War II, that's not happening now.
Well, there have been incidents of mass slaughter in Ukraine. For instance, Bucha, when they Bucha was one of those suburbs on the outskirts of Kiev in Ukraine that was taken in the initial days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And once the Russian armies retreated several weeks later, they found hundreds of people buried in mass graves in the town. These things actually are happening, not on the horrendous scale, but they're very similar. You think of Gaza. Now it's hard to know. There's a lot of propaganda around. We don't know the exact number of people who've been killed in the missile strikes and aerial bombing of Gaza, but it's in the they're claiming now that it's up to 40,000. Even if it's only half that, that's a lot. That is actually on the same scale as the number of people who died in a lot of bombings of cities in the Second World War.
In a day.
In a day. But
in a day we would knock out as many as Israel has in a year.
That's true. But
in a day we'd knock out 100,000 people in some of the periods of World War II.
Well, certainly the bombing of Tokyo and the firestorm in Hamburg and Dresden and places like this. A lot of those bombed cities, actually, not a lot of people were killed because of, they were in shelters and the cities never caught fire. Anyway, it's a very technical. I mean, I'm not drawing a direct numerical comparison. What I'm saying is it's the same sort of thing. Cities being bombed, thousands of people are being killed. This has all happened before. We've seen this before.
I often try to take myself back to the mindset of people for whom the most remarkable moments in history were only just unfolding because, they didn't know that they were coming.
Yeah.
My grandmother, when she was in Poland and she left Poland at the urging of her ne'er-do-well French-Polish boyfriend in 1938.
Very smart.
Yeah, and the rest of her Jewish family were all wiped out.
Yeah.
She, a lot of people say, he must have been so wise or they had such vision. They were probably crazy for being that paranoid. Like in the context of 1938, it probably seemed loopy to think that Germany was about to relaunch another massive European conflict. I mean, I'm sure there were people saying it, obviously. There were people worried about it. But like the idea that you would upheave your entire life and go instead of just figure, we've muddled through before, we'll muddle through again was the attitude of all of the rest of their families, which was probably the more reasonable way to think. And I sometimes wonder just temperamentally where you want that setting to be at. How cautious do you want to be at any point in time? You don't want to be uprooting your life all the time and constantly shrieking at windmills, nor do you want to be complacent.
No, well, the people who probably stayed for good reasons. They had a nice house, a nice job. They had investments. They had, which they were going to lose if they left. And then imagine if they'd left and then Hitler had fallen and they'd lost everything.
That's true. And my grandmother was 19 years old and had no money anyway, so she might as well. Yeah,
exactly. But my point is that, this could happen again. I don't have any policies that are going to stop it happening again. But what I do have is a sort of I want our politicians to think that it might happen again. I want people to start thinking historically. I think one of the problems that we have in our society is the lack of historical understanding. Very few people study history at schools and at universities anymore. And if you look at our leaders, they tend to think as management consultants, as bureaucrats, as technocrats. They don't think as in the way that statesmen thought a couple of generations ago when all of this was unfolding for the first time. And so they don't tend to take the warning signs seriously or even see them. So this is my call for our politicians, is to think historically. Stop thinking that some little adjustment in the tax scales is going to solve all our problems in the world, because it's not.
You, towards the end of the book, before you get to the conclusion, you lay out a montage of a series of snapshots of events which kind of try to articulate the vision that you have of what's going wrong. You give one quote from Donald Trump's speech where he's announcing his second bid for the presidency in March of 2023.
Yeah.
And then you jump to Hungary, where Viktor Orban is addressing a crowd and saying, "Make America great, make Europe great again." And then you flash to May of 2024 with Vladimir Putin, right after Alexei Navalny has been murdered, and he's just won his latest election, Putin, that is. And then you flash to October of 2023 with the Hamas attack, and then you flash to Netanyahu saying that he's going to rain fire down on Gaza. That is quite, that gives a visceral account to me of the different ways in which things are going wrong. But I don't understand what the common thread is. Is there one?
Well, the common thread is that we've seen all this before, after the First World War.
But what's the common thread between... I have a sense, an instinctive sense, that these are causally related in some way. So destabilization, I don't know, economic stagnation, globalization. You could point to a number of things. But is there a link between Trump, Putin, Orban, Hamas, Likud?
Savagery. Our world is becoming a savage place. Our politics isn't the nice, soft, gentle politics it was just a generation ago. The world is entering into a new period of savagery. I mean, this was what George Orwell observed during the 1930s. In 1938-9, he wrote a novel called Coming Up for Air, in which the characters have visions of the coming of another war after the Great War that their parents fought in, and I think this is, and he said that we're entering a new age of savagery, where concentration camps were being set up, where political opponents were being murdered and assassinated, where the gulags were being created, where there were wars in Europe were starting, like the Spanish Civil War, much like the Ukraine war now, where right-wing dictators stood, on platforms and, used violent language and urged people to kill others. I mean, there's the thread. The thread is the coming back of an age of savagery, which, in some ways we're still asleep to the fact that just how bad this is becoming.
By the way, one point that you didn't note about the Donald Trump speech when he's giving his second bid announcing his second bid for the presidency in March of 2023. You know why it was in Waco?
Yeah, that's the site of the Waco massacre.
Well, and so March of 2023 was the 30-year anniversary.
Exactly,
He said, of course, like everything he says, he had no idea. But it's interesting that
rather chilling, isn't it? Like
exactly.
The site of a massacre of sort of this these sort of irrational people who took on the police with guns.
Although to the people for whom that is symbolically resonant, they would say, yeah, it was a massacre by the deep state / FBI / government gone out of control, trampling over the religious and gun liberties of people who weren't hurting anybody. And that's what they're pushing back against.
Yeah, and they're crazy.
Well, what's wrong with that? You can't just say that, Dennis. You have to articulate what's wrong with that worldview. Well, you don't have to, but if you want anyone to take you seriously,
the deep state, the view that there's some sort of deep state trampling on people's rights and coming to take away our guns and so forth just seems to me like a crazy conspiracy theory of the far right that doesn't have much.
Well, okay, there's an entrenched set of interests in Washington, D.C. that in that case express themselves through literally an attempt to take away some people's guns and in the process and to not allow them to assemble and have faith the way they saw fit.
Well, look, I can't remember all the details about Waco, but I assume that they have the guns illegally and people are coming to enforce the law. And
that's right. It was
in a democracy, we obey the law.
Yeah, well, I mean, the renegade Trump supporter or the far right voter would say that's all very. It's a very easy thing to say when you're the one writing the laws and when you're writing laws that suit you, the elites.
Yeah, but laws are made by Congress, which is elected by the people, and that's under the Constitution, and that's the basis of liberal democracy. We can't have the society being run by people who don't accept the basis of who don't accept the basis of democratically made laws.
No, true. But I mean, one reason why Congress is full of people who you would regard as being right-wing nut jobs is because these voters have tried to increasingly use the democratic process to elect people like Marjorie Taylor Greene or whoever else these, far-right people might be who are deeply antithetical to the whole project of liberal democracy and to representative government, to go to Washington and take back power as they see it for the little guy.
Yeah, well, I think it's really worrying, that such a large and growing proportion of the American electorate feel totally alienated from the mainstream of their political system. And it's really up to us to try and create a society and an economy which, deals them in, which listens to them, which talks to them. I think one of the things behind this is the way our politicians speak. My day job, as well as writing books, is that I'm a political speechwriter. Yeah. And one of the things I've observed over the years is that people in the centre and the left tend to talk in very managerial ways, very technically. They don't talk in ways that ordinary people tend to understand. They sound like management consultants, not like politicians. And then someone like Donald Trump or Boris Johnson, Orban, others come along, and all of a sudden they sound like ordinary people. They use the same words, they speak in the same tone. They are able to articulate emotions rather than just, facts and reason. And this is what attracts people to them. And I think people in the centre and the left have to learn again the art of speaking to ordinary people on the same level as them, because really they've completely lost touch. I sort of despair, pull my hair out listening to a lot of politicians. They make speeches talking about inputs and outputs and productivity and management and reviews and so forth. Ordinary people don't care about those things.
No.
They want jobs.
Yeah.
They want higher living standards. They want their kids to finish school. They don't want the hospitals to be, to have long queues waiting for elective surgery and so forth. And I think democratic politicians have lost the art of speaking simply to people. And it was interesting when Tim Walz, the Democratic vice presidential nominee, came out and just used that word weird. All of a sudden, here was somebody who'd been a teacher, who was more at the level of the people, was able to just articulate simply how ordinary people think and talk. And this, in a sense, has caused a sea change in the American election. With the use of a word, all of a sudden he's caused Democrats to start thinking differently and articulating they're programmed differently. And
Yeah.
it's a simple thing like this can, has a lot of effect.
It's interesting that you make that point about language and managerial speak,
Yeah.
because prior to the populist takeover of the right, traditional conservatives also had difficulty cutting through. I mean, if you think of a kind of a Mitt Romney type or a Paul Ryan type, the old school conservative who believes in small government, and traditional family values also speaks like a robot, just in a slightly different way than the left does. What's happened is that the right got so fed up with robots and with out-of-touch elites that they essentially replaced, at least in the United States they did, they replaced that version of republicanism with a populist version that actually on economic issues has more of a European right-wing flavour, which is actually quite left-wing on social issues. Certainly Trump doesn't go around talking about cutting Medicare or balancing the budget or cutting social benefits or privatizing Social Security or any one of a number of things that all of his forebears in the Republican Party did. He's just let's talk straight, let's say it straight, and let's do heartland stuff.
Yeah. It's they've learned the art of connecting with ordinary people, and in some ways, this on a more dramatic scale, this is what happened in the 20s and 30s as well. This is how Hitler came to power. I mean, Hitler was just one of a number of dime a dozen street corner anti-Semites in Germany in the 1920s, but he learnt the art of speaking and connecting with people. He learnt the art of understanding their hurt, had their feelings about Germany's loss during the Second World War and about the economic collapse of Germany and so forth. He learned how to connect. The First World War. He learned how to connect with ordinary people, and that's how he rose to power, through the power of his oratory. And this is, and I think in some ways this is how we account for Trump, those huge rallies, with the rhetoric that to us seems crazy, but he knows from repetition, connects with ordinary people, makes them listen to him. He sounds like he understands them. And I think this is something we have to study and counter.
I'm glad we're not playing an Adolf Hitler drinking game where I have to take a shot every time you go back to Hitler, because I'd be wasted by now, Dennis. Let's talk about how the left can talk better then as a speechwriter. Like the people who do it well, I think of Obama as being probably the most remarkable recent incarnation of somebody who can speak with incredible poetry that connects to everybody's soul from a progressive place. I mean, even Kevin Rudd in Australia in 2007, there was a lot of excitement about Kevin Rudd. He seemed to capture something that an electorate that was weary of John Howard was hungry for. How do you do it?
It's very difficult, and it changes quite a lot. Let's think of Obama. Obama's in the he's in the sort of the style of the great orators of post-war America. You think of the Kennedys. Obama was the new Kennedy. All those Kennedys were great at this sort of thing. And it was a very sort of highfalutin, high rhetorical style that he had. And it took him a long way. It took Obama from being an Illinois state legislator into the Senate. He then spoke at the nominating convention for John Kerry and wowed the audience. And this rhetorical ability, he was a nobody, and he used this rhetorical ability to beat the Clinton machine to become president of the United States. It worked for him, and it enthused the Democratic base. But I think over time, people sort of got a bit weary of this highfalutin sort of Roman-style rhetoric, and its effect wore off.
Professorial was the adjective that everybody would end up using.
Yeah. And Kevin Rudd was in sort of a different style. He was sort of a bit hokey, down to earth, wasn't he? I'm Kevin and I'm here to help.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. And I think that worked for a long time. The problem was that he then once he got into government, he descended and he almost became what I always used to think of Kevin as not sort of the prime minister, but the nation's #1 management consultant. You know, he would line up facts and figures and talk about, you know, programmatic specificity and so forth. And, you know, he just completely forgot how to connect with ordinary people. I mean, the hokey things aside, it fell apart. It didn't work. I think Julia Gillard, I think she had a good style when she was deputy prime minister. I think she connected with people. She sounded like a real warm human being. And then I think she got lost rhetorically when she became prime minister, and started to try and consciously sound like a prime minister. And then I think it sort of went badly for her.
When did you write? You wrote for Gillard, right?
I wrote for her for quite a long time when she was in opposition and when she was deputy prime minister.
And what were the challenges and opportunities of writing for her?
Well, the opportunities for writing for Julia were great. I mean, people really liked her initially. People wanted to listen to her. She was the first woman, you know, to get the top job. She sounded intelligent and smart. And, you know, it was a pleasure to work for her. She's actually very, you know, there's a difference. A lot of people aren't good to work for. Julia was very good to work for. She's a very nice person to have as your boss. So she was, you know, she was great to work with, and initially a good speechwriter. But I think the problem was that she just rhetorically lost her way getting into power and just started to you know, she spoke slowly and deliberately and tried to sound like a prime minister, and I think that's where she lost. And I think so. This is not to sort of like attack Julia, but I think there's a problem generally in Australian politics, which is that we're not like the American system where you learn to speak, you know, at mass rallies. You have to win primary votes. They have a rhetorical culture, and in the end, when you get the nomination, you have to wow an 80,000 seat stadium, you know, almost as big as the MCG, with your nomination address. In Australia, it's all done by the back rooms. So people come to power by winning ballots in the caucus. They never develop the habits of speaking and winning over audiences in tight situations. And this starts in student politics, where it all happens in back rooms, and then it continues in local politics, where it's factions make the decisions, and it continues into the caucuses of all the parties in Canberra, where it's all done by arm twisting and so forth. So they never actually have to win over the people and wow them. And I think if anyone wants to become a successful politician in Australia, become a good speech maker, because you'll stand out like a sore thumb. Yeah.
Well, that is how, I mean, really, Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull, two of the most popular prime ministers when they entered office in recent history, both cut their teeth not amongst their colleagues, but by winning over the Australian public in public interviews. I mean, Kevin Rudd had a regular segment on, I think, the Today Show or Sunrise on morning television and was popular there. And Malcolm Turnbull was a fixture on Q&A, the ABC show, wearing his leather jacket and taking pot shots at the government. It was going direct to the public. But
it wasn't set piece speech making.
No.
I mean, people can get good for a while at giving the soundbite or appearing as a talking head on television and being entertaining, but they don't get up in front of mass rallies and wow audiences. It just doesn't seem to happen. And in a sense, that's because we don't have the audiences. We don't have the culture that gives them to them. You know, during our election campaigns, at most, the leaders of the parties would speak 2 or 3 times to controlled audiences of a few hundred people. And it's very hard in those situations to generate enthusiasm and energy and fun and laughter and all the things you need to make a speech.
Is that because the Australian voters and media would find it a bit unseemly? I mean, I just think you're probably going to get more political capital during a campaign here by being seen on a farm shaking the hands of some, you know, local women who've made some scones than giving a massive rally. I think Aussies are not like Americans. We'd probably think the candidates a bit up themselves if they held a rally in front of 80,000 people. Yeah,
the big rallies are sort of, in some ways, it's a thing of the past. In Australia, we tend not to do it anymore. We've responded to television differently than in America. by, just giving the soundbite and doing the doorstop interview. I mean, that's what election campaigns are now. They're not big rallies every day. They're just a doorstop outside a photo opportunity.
Right. A doorstop is basically where the candidate just tells the press that they're going to have 5 minutes as they're coming in or out of a particular building, and they just sort of stop and answer.
This is the daily organisation of the election campaign. This is what happens now. This is the focus of the day is getting the doorstop right rather than having the big rally. Yeah.
One of the when you mentioned that left-wing candidates have a tendency to sound a little bit alien because they're so mechanical and managerial in their speech. One thing that I worry about as having given greater strength to the right is the inability of the left recently to speak plainly about issues of sort of controversial cultural identity politics, where they can sound like they're on a different planet because they're tripping over themselves to make sure they don't say something that's going to have a Twitter mob go after them and accuse them of either using the improper term for an undocumented alien and calling them an illegal immigrant instead, or whether they're going to misgender somebody or they're going to say the wrong thing about precisely some social issue. How do you wrestle with that? Do you think that's a nothing burger? Is that just a right-wing beat up? What do you think of it?
Well, a lot of the reason that they do this is for very good reasons. I mean, we don't want to go around, stirring up hatred against minorities. We don't want to go around making people feel bad just because
I'm not
other angry people.
I don't think it's about avoiding stirring up hatred towards minorities. There's an elite consensus that seems to get handed down from, academia about a new way that you're supposed to talk about something. I mean, in the US, this is more pronounced than here, but, all of a sudden everyone will be using a term like Latinx instead of Latina and Latino, which is not stirring up hate against any community. It's a gender-neutral thing that gender studies people have come up with, which no Latinos or Latinas actually use or even understand, and sounds clunky to absolutely everybody except for a few people. It's got nothing to do with hate speech or not hate speech. It's only hate speech not to use it in the eyes of a tiny number of, hyper-censorious and very active online social justice thinkers.
Yeah. It's a very difficult. This is a very difficult question for people on the left, because certainly.
To hear the rest of this conversation, go to uncomfortableconversations.substack.com/listen, and you will get your own personal premium podcast feed with at least 3 extra episodes of the podcast every month and heaps of extra stuff, including the remainder right now of the fabulous conversation you've just been hearing. If it was worth listening to this much of, don't rob yourself of the rest. Pull out your phone right now and search for Uncomfortable Conversations on Substack.